Is it time to unfreeze Afghanistan's assets? Calls to release financial support grow louder as concerns rise over a humanitarian disaster if international restrictions aren't lifted. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Afghanistan's crumbling economy. No money, no work, and no food. As the harsh winter grips Afghanistan, people are in desperate need of assistance. Nearly 4 months after the Taliban's rapid takeover, Afghanistan is descending into one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Still internationally unrecognized as the official government in Afghanistan, the Taliban is struggling to deliver basic services, and the United Nations has warned that the country's banking system is at risk of a colossal failure. In a move to prevent the worst, Democratic lawmakers in the United States have called on the Treasury to unfreeze Afghanistan's central bank reserves. The group of Democratic congressmen and women say they are deeply concerned by the continued U.S. freeze of Afghanistan's foreign reserves and urge the government to ease restrictions on the country's access to funds. More than 40 Democrats signed the letter, stressing that while they supported the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, they also agree with international calls to avoid imposing economic measures that could contribute to a new refugee and hunger crisis. But the U.S. Treasury argues the crisis might not be resolved by releasing those reserves and that the Taliban could use the funds for something other than humanitarian aid. Congressional Republicans also oppose unfreezing the assets, saying the U.S. cannot allow the Taliban to even access small amounts of funding in light of the group's continued human rights abuses. The United Nations last week concluded there were credible allegations of more than 100 extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan since the Taliban took power in August, despite the group's announcement of a general amnesty. The UN Deputy Rights Chief says she was deeply alarmed by those reports.
Between August and November, we received credible allegations of more than 100 killings of former Afghan National Security Forces and others associated with the former government, with at least 72 of these killings attributed to the Taliban. In several cases, the bodies were publicly displayed.
While foreign powers are understandably wary of funding the Taliban, the economic fallout is hurting ordinary people the most. In Kabul, hundreds of demonstrators have marched toward the U.S. Embassy, pleading for the release of the frozen assets in the hopes that those funds will ease their suffering. Their banners read, "Let us eat." Already one of the poorest countries in the world, frozen assets, economic sanctions, and a huge brain drain are all compounding the pain. Afghanistan also faces a dire cash shortage that has crippled banks and businesses, sent food and fuel prices soaring, and triggered a devastating hunger crisis.
Whatever I had at home, now I'm selling second-hand clothes here to feed my children. I have 8 children and my husband is dead. I went to all education ministry offices, but they didn't care about my services and didn't do anything for me.
We don't have any hope. I don't think things will get better. I'm just coming here to work and earn some money to feed my family and be able to live through this winter. And after this winter, we will have to leave and escape from here.
Afghanistan's currency lost almost 12% of its value against the U.S. dollar following the Taliban takeover. The IMF warns that the country's banking system is at risk of a colossal failure that would lead to a 30% contraction of GDP. According to the UN, 23 million people are now facing hunger. The World Health Organization says that around 3.2 million children are likely to suffer from acute malnutrition by the end of the year. And 1 million of those are at risk of dying as temperatures drop. Well, to discuss U.S.-based efforts to unfreeze Afghan assets, I'm joined by Adam Weinstein. He's a Quincy Institute Research Fellow and a former U.S. Marine who served in Afghanistan. He joins us now from London. Thanks so much for being with us, Adam. You know, there's concern now at the highest levels, really, of the U.S. government that something needs to be done. More than 40 congressional Democrats, as you know, have called for the Treasury to unfreeze those Afghan funds. But how likely is it that their calls will actually lead to any change in policy on Afghanistan here?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. In fact, there are two different letters that came out of Congress, and the message of those letters is clear that the Biden administration needs to act now. I think what the administration is worried about is the optics of doing anything that might be perceived to help the Taliban. Of course, the risk of taking no action is that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Afghans may starve.
Right. I mean, nobody wants civilians to suffer, but they also don't want to offer assistance that could embolden the Taliban either. I mean, is there a way to really do this?
Well, I think, look, that's a false choice that's presented. The Taliban don't need to be emboldened any further. They marched into the capital, Kabul, 3 months ago. So I think the Taliban are already emboldened in that sense. And the truth is that the Taliban were beneficiaries of the international aid regime over the last 20 years. It's why they didn't have to provide any government services to the parts of Afghanistan that they controlled. The way to do it is to insert enough liquidity into the Afghan economy to keep it afloat and ensure that we don't have a humanitarian catastrophe, and accept that a failed state in Afghanistan, and many people will say it's already a failed state, but it could become much worse. A failed Afghanistan doesn't benefit anyone.
Of course not. But I mean, Adam, as you say, the Taliban's already emboldened, so, giving humanitarian aid couldn't further embolden them. That's some say a false case, because they do and could have the opportunity to divert whatever resources land in Afghanistan. So tell us, I mean, how honest you think the Taliban is when it comes to distributing humanitarian aid. If they say it will not be diverted or sold for any other sort of profit or purchase, can they be trusted?
Well, I don't think any recipient government in Afghanistan could have been trusted. The last government diverted a great amount of international aid to their own personal bank accounts. Now, of course, I don't want to draw false equivalency with the Taliban. The risks with the Taliban are greater, especially given their relationship with terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda. But there are ways to do this that really minimize those risks, whether it be by having international oversight. There's certain delivery mechanisms for the money, and it doesn't have to necessarily land on a Kabul airstrip. And in terms of pallets of cash, it can be distributed directly to international NGOs and local NGOs in a way that it can reach the people. Now, will some risk exist? Of course, but let's remember that the Taliban have been very good at having their own funding model. So I think the bigger risk, even from a terrorism perspective, is to allow the country to descend into chaos in a way that will really embolden groups like ISKP, which are, in the grand scheme of things, a bigger threat than the Taliban.
Okay. Adam, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it. Now, the push by some U.S. Democrats to unfreeze Afghanistan's assets is not the only attempt to get money flowing into the country again. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has announced a humanitarian trust fund to get aid to Afghanistan without directly dealing with Taliban authorities. At a special meeting in Pakistan on Sunday, delegates from Muslim nations resolved to work with the United Nations to unlock millions of dollars worth of frozen funds. They agreed for the Islamic Development Bank to begin channeling financial assistance to the people by the first quarter of next year. So just how urgent is that assistance? Well, joining me now is Obaidullah Baheer. He is a lecturer in transitional justice at the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. He recently wrote an opinion piece for The National that argues it is time to unfreeze Afghanistan's assets. Rahela Sidiqi is in London. She's the founding director of the Rahela Trust for Afghan Women's Education and a former senior advisor at UN Habitat Afghanistan. And from Milan is Haroun Rahimi, an assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. Thanks all so much for being with us. Obaidullah Baheer, you've been in Kabul, you're Afghan yourself. Help us understand really how bad it is right now, especially when compared, to what the country has already been through. Is this a new low for Afghanistan?
It's a new low for the whole world. This is a famine we have seen the likes of the last time we saw it was in Stalin's regime when he starved Ukraine. We have not seen this scale. And the worst bit is that a lot of it is man-made. Yes, there is a drought, but beyond that, the amount of sanctions on Afghanistan, the lack of liquidity within the economy, the large-scale joblessness with regards to the sudden change of regime, all of those have hit Afghans really hard. Please note that Afghanistan already had 70% of its population below the poverty line. We did not have access to a lot of the rural areas because of security concerns, and the government was doing a good job covering up the dire need of malnourishment within the country and the poverty to not appear as a failed state. But now that the war is over, we have access and we have data that shows that this is an unprecedented scale of human suffering that we have to do something about.
And tell us quickly, if you can, I mean, how is whatever money is getting into the country actually getting in? Is this all hawala-based now and, unreliable? We know of even journalists and aid workers, some of them I've heard have to leave because they can't even get paid if they're working out of Afghanistan.
A lot of organizations around the world can't get their money into Afghanistan. They wouldn't pay you. Media outlets would not pay you if you are in Afghanistan. So that's a huge issue. And the fact that the banking sector here is in shambles as well makes it very difficult. The hawala system is an alternative that is being used, but that too with the quick depletion of cash in the economy makes it more and more difficult. People have started using the old dollars at the same rate as the newer dollars are, which just shows you how desperate the economy is becoming.
Right. Rahela, the question is, how do you help the people that you all desperately want to help without obviously helping the Taliban? I mean, what is the minimum you think that can at least be done?
On conditional basis, the money could be sent the humanitarian assistance fund, like 500 million, which has been from the trust fund, could be released to Afghanistan on conditional basis. For example, if the money goes to the Afghanistan bank, then it could be considered, for example, for a salary of the teachers. The amount is very clear. We call it taxis, or the amount of money or fund which should be given to the as a salaries budget for the salaries of the teachers. It's very clear how much is that. So with close monitoring, I'm giving one example. And for example, the fund which should go to the private sector banks to be transferred to for example, to private universities, private schools, that can be used also to be channeled based on the budget which has been specified.
Okay.
But because there is a starvation, there is 3.3 million of children don't have sufficient foods, and 22 million of populations, 0.8 populations doesn't have enough food. So food insecurity and starvation is the priority for Afghan nations, and that has to be supported, but in control, in condition, with close monitoring through the humanitarian assistance organizations such as UN and non-governmental organizations.
Right. I mean, so Rahela, when you hear about these efforts, for example, by the U.S. Congress people that we spoke about earlier, you must be encouraged, but then you have Republicans on the other side of the bench saying, no, we absolutely refuse to let any money go through and to have those assets unfrozen because the Taliban will find ways to divert those funds and use them for nefarious purposes. Do you think that's true in any sense, or is there certainly ways that this money can get in to save lives and not be used by the Taliban or diverted?
Well, if the world has several ways and a mechanism of controlling and a mechanism of monitoring the process. So it should be very strict considerations, but people should not starve, and the money should flow to Afghanistan in a way that it is again, I would say in condition with close monitoring and control, so that the money really goes to the people who are in need,
Okay.
and by the organization, trustful organizations,
Okay.
humanitarian
So
organizations.
monitoring is everything. Okay, let me turn to Haroun Rahimi. You know, as we said, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has set up that humanitarian trust fund to get assistance to Afghanistan while bypassing the Taliban. First of all, tell us if you think it'll work, and if so, why isn't everybody doing that?
I think it's worthwhile to break down this problem. There are many issues. One is delivery of aid into Afghanistan, humanitarian aid. That is not primarily a funding issue. That's a question of sanctions, basically removing access to the Afghanistan financial system. And the way to resolve that would be for the United States to ease the sanctions or provide broad exemptions and to financial institutions, so the money can actually flow into the country. So that's the aid delivery aspect of it. There's also the issue of working with the Taliban in the process of delivering aid, making sure the aid reaches the people who need them the most, not the one preferred by the Taliban. That would require Taliban to provide some assurances. What we know so far is that they have provided such assurances. UN officials and others who talked to them said they are willing to work with the aid delivery organizations. The other issue is providing government services, education, health, electricity, critical infrastructures, a lot of things government used to do that it no longer can because it doesn't have the budget. That gets more complicated. There are ways to deliver pay salaries of teachers and health workers. Things are being considered without involvement of the Taliban, with Taliban approval to step back and bypassing the government institutions. Those are the avenues that are pursued right now, but they're much more complicated and the process has been slow. When it gets to other aspects of government services, like paying electricity bills so the people can actually have access to electricity, maintaining critical infrastructure, it becomes even more and more complicated to bypass Taliban. And it becomes, to some degree, necessary to collaborate with the Taliban in order to make sure Afghanistan does not become a worse case of a failed state than it actually is. There is an issue of actually having an economy. Most 38 plus million people cannot just live on aid. There is a need for a functioning economy. That requires the trade routes to open. That requires the currency to stabilize. That requires the sanctions to ease, as well as some funds to be returned so the financial system can survive.
Right. Let me ask Obaidullah then, how you get to a functioning economy if you still have a government that gets absolutely no recognition from any foreign power whatsoever. What's the path forward here? Can the Taliban somehow establish some level of legitimacy to get those sanctions lessened? What are at least the basic steps the Taliban can take to get some kind of recognition? Would it have to come in the form of just, for example, getting girls back to school, establishing some level of women's rights? What would it take?
There has to be communication, right? One of the major reasons why dialogues and negotiations fail is when we don't engage with one another, we don't communicate expectations with one another. Grandstanding politics aren't working. The louder we become about conditions to aid, conditions to lifting the sanctions, the more the Taliban seek refuge within their ranks, within their ideology, the more rigid they become. The international community understood the utility of track 2 diplomacy and negotiating with the Taliban behind closed doors during the Doha negotiations. Somehow they have forgotten that trick when it comes to the current circumstances. The Taliban have a reputational cost with regards to their own fighters, and there are specific things they cannot negotiate or compromise on in the open. They have won militarily. That total victory gives them certain leverage. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the Taliban and the international community to decide what. If the moral pathway is to reduce suffering, then the way forward is to engage and find a way through together. Because like Rahimi said, unless there's a functioning economy, aid will never be enough, because this Afghanistan, the failure we're at right now, is because of the absence of structural economy and the dependence on aid.
Rahela, let me ask you, I mean, how serious are your concerns then if the international community does really open those lines of communication that Obaidullah was referring to and starts talking to the Taliban? Do you fear it can give them this sense of legitimacy that could actually, empower them not to deliver on some of the promises they'd made, some of the guarantees, especially when it comes to your area of expertise, in particular, women's rights?
I think the fundamental factor here is the human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan has more than half of the population, and basically human rights in Afghanistan, and that should be the top conditions for the international communities and citizens of Afghanistan, that if the human rights and women's rights are not considered, Taliban legitimacy should not be considered at all, but providing support to the nation of Afghanistan is important. And I would echo Obaidullah and also our other colleagues' points in terms of establishing economic system and also social service systems in Afghanistan to come back online in terms of education, in terms of health services, and also the process of sustainable development in Afghanistan, so that Afghanistan, the whole socioeconomic system, are not collapsed totally.
Rahela, how optimistic are you that engaging with the Taliban can become a reality to the point where they actually do respect the human rights issues, especially on women, that you feel so passionately about? Do you really feel that they could become partners in this?
And to be honest,
go ahead.
I'm not. Yeah, to be honest, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that the Taliban, looking to the previous practices of Taliban,
and that's what I don't understand. If it's completely logical to say, as I agree with you, human rights have to be put first. They do have to deliver on those guarantees, but nobody really believes they will. It's not in their heart. It's not in their modus operandi to put those kinds of rights first. So where does that leave millions of suffering people?
Yeah, I think the world leaders, this case of Afghanistan is the responsibility of the world, of the international communities as well. The problems here that the people of Afghanistan has not been heard. Honestly, the majority of the communication was with the Taliban and the international community in between the two, but the people of Afghanistan have been ignored, and that's why this historical disasters in the world. Which has not been recorded in the last after the Second World War is Afghanistan situation, Afghanistan humanitarian crisis.
Haroun Rahimi,
just to comment.
I just wanted to get
on that.
Okay, very quickly. Yeah, we only have a few minutes. I wanted to get Haroun back in. Go ahead.
That's all right. I just wanted to say that recognize one thing. It's not like there are no takebacks. So if we gauge or limit our aid and engagement with the Taliban based on their compliance, we can increase and decrease it according to their behavior in the future as well. It's not like we just engage with them and that whitewashes everything or legalizes everything they do.
But I mean, Haroun Rahimi, how is women's rights even a starting point, really, with the Taliban, if they won't even allow girls to return to schools until they are fully segregated and there is no money to fully segregate them accordingly? How does this get moving if the starting point is a non-starter for the Taliban?
Again, I think it's worth breaking things down. When it comes to the delivery of life-saving aid, I think there should be no condition but that the Taliban should respect the autonomy of the aid service delivery so aid can reach those who need them, right? And even there, 100% guarantee is not possible. It has never been possible. We need to consider what is the acceptable level of risk, considering the harm that will come from inactions. As was discussed, millions dead could be a reality. But when you go beyond life-saving aid, when we're talking about recognizing Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan, as a group that can speak on behalf of a nation on important issues, Then I think matters of human rights, women rights, respecting the basic rights of Afghans should be part of the negotiation. Again, as I think Baheer said, highlighted, we have to realize that it's going to be a process. Taliban will need to make progress to build internal legitimacy. And they would also have to receive some payoff from those progress so they can convince their files and ranks. The Muslim community of the world, Muslim countries, have a special role to play because Taliban would be different for Taliban to consider the views of Muslim countries compared to the Western countries ideologically. So they are much more likely to be persuaded by the Muslim voices. It creates a special obligation for the Muslim countries to intervene. But I think it's very important to distinguish these two issues. The fact that there's an urgent need for humanitarian aid, and it should not be conditioned on anything because it's a matter of need. Starving women to death will not help achieve their human rights. The girls out of school, if their parents cannot feed them, it doesn't really matter if they can go to school or not.
Okay.
The next step becomes a matter of a longer-term view, which would have to be more comprehensive.
Haroun Rahimi, Obaidullah
Yes.
Baheer, and Rahela Sidiqi, I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciate your input, and to our viewers as well, of course. Thanks for watching. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.